After 5 years of saving every extra penny from my teaching salary, I finally had enough for a down payment on my first home. When I first drove down Maple Avenue and saw the pristine lawns, freshly painted mailboxes, and children playing freely in the cul-de-sacs, I knew this was where I wanted to start my new chapter. The small two-bedroom house with blue shutters sat on the corner lot of Willow Lane. It was not extravagant by any measure, but to me, it represented everything I had worked for. The real estate agent mentioned there was a homeowners association, but assured me it was standard for protecting property values. The monthly fee seemed reasonable for the maintained common areas and community pool. I signed the final papers on a bright Tuesday morning, feeling a sense of accomplishment that I had never experienced before. My very own home, with my name on the deed. The neighbors welcomed me with homemade cookies and offers to help with the move. Mrs. Henderson from across the street brought over a casserole on my first evening. The Johnson family next door invited me to their weekend barbecue. Everything felt perfect, almost too perfect, like a neighborhood from a television commercial. 2 weeks after moving in, I received a welcome packet from the Maple Grove Estates HOA. It contained a 60-page booklet of guidelines and regulations. The typography was immaculate, the binding professional. I skimmed through it, noting rules about trash can placement, approved mailbox designs, and lawn maintenance schedules. Nothing seemed unreasonable, though the level of detail was surprising. A separate letter informed me of the monthly meeting schedule and encouraged new homeowner attendance. The following weekend, I decided to plant a small flower garden in my front yard. The previous owners had left a bare patch that looked neglected compared to the rest of the property. I spent hours selecting native wildflowers that would attract butterflies and bees. The work was satisfying, connecting with the earth of my new home, watching it transform under my care. 3 days later, the first envelope appeared in my mailbox. Official HOA letterhead informed me that my unauthorized landscape modifications violated Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the Community Guidelines. I had to remove the wildflowers within 48 hours or face a fine of $50 per day. The letter was signed Catherine Winters, HOA President. I was confused. There was nothing in the guidelines prohibiting flower gardens that I could find. I reread the entire landscaping section that evening, finding only vague references to community aesthetic standards and approved vegetation. The next morning, I called the number listed on the HOA letterhead and left a polite message asking for clarification. No one returned my call. 4 days later, a second envelope appeared, thicker than the first. The fine had begun accruing and now stood at $200. This time, specific guidelines were highlighted about unauthorized structural or aesthetic changes without prior written approval. But there was no mention of how to obtain such approval. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting to address the issue directly. The community center was half full when I arrived. At the front table sat 4 board members, and at the center was Catherine Winters. She looked to be in her early 60s, immaculately dressed in a navy pantsuit with not a hair out of place. Her reading glasses hung from a gold chain around her neck. When the meeting opened for resident concerns, I raised my hand and politely explained my situation. Before I could finish, Catherine interrupted. "Are you the new owner on Willow Lane?" Her voice was pleasant, but her eyes were cold and evaluating. When I nodded, she continued, "We take our community standards very seriously here. The approval forms are available on our website, though modifications to front yards are rarely approved. We find consistency maintains our property values." As I tried to explain that I could not find these forms, she spoke over me again. Perhaps you should familiarize yourself with how things work around here before making changes. We will discuss your violation in our executive session. Next item, please." I sat back down, feeling my face flush with embarrassment. As the meeting continued, I noticed how Catherine controlled every discussion, how other board members deferred to her without question. On my way out, an older gentleman whispered, "Welcome to Catherine's kingdom. Tread carefully." The fines continued to accumulate. Each week brought a new envelope, each more threatening than the last. I removed the wildflowers, returning the patch to bare soil, but still the notices came. Now they cited insufficient lawn coverage for the same area. I felt trapped in a cruel game where the rules changed constantly. I sent formal emails requesting the approval forms and specific guidelines. The responses, when they came, were vague and unhelpful. "Please refer to the community standards document," or "the board reviews each case individually." When I attempted to call Catherine directly, her voicemail was always full. At the local hardware store, I ran into the Johnsons from next door. When I mentioned my struggles with the HOA, their friendly demeanor shifted to concern. "Be careful with Catherine," Mrs. Johnson whispered, glancing around as if the HOA president might materialize in the paint aisle. The Millers on Oak Street questioned a violation last year. Suddenly, they had weekly inspections and fines for everything from their mailbox height to the shade of their door paint. Mr. Johnson nodded gravely. "And remember the Patels. They installed a small wheelchair ramp for their father when he visited. Even with medical documentation, Catherine forced them to remove it, claiming it decreased street appeal." Over coffee at their kitchen table, they shared more stories. The elderly couple who had tended roses for 30 years forced to rip them out because Catherine suddenly decided they were non-conforming vegetation. The single mother who lost 6 feet of her backyard in a property line dispute when Catherine produced surveys that contradicted county records. "And the Samuels family," Mrs. Johnson added quietly. "Their son has severe autism and needed special sensory equipment in the backyard. Catherine claimed it violated height restrictions for play equipment. They fought it, but the legal fees became too much. They moved away last summer." The pattern became clear. Catherine did not merely enforce rules. She wielded them as weapons against anyone who challenged her authority. It was around this time that I decided to place my mother's memorial statue in my garden. Mom had passed away just months before I bought the house. The small stone angel, no taller than 2 feet, had stood in her garden for decades. Having it in mind made this new house feel more like home, a connection to her memory. The violation notice appeared within 24 hours. Unauthorized ornamental fixture. The fine was $200, with daily increases if not removed immediately. This time, there was an additional note. Continued noncompliance will result in legal action and possible property seizure under covenant enforcement provisions. I spent hours that night poring over the HOA documentation. The language was deliberately vague, full of subjective terms like appropriate, suitable, and community standards. However, buried in the amendments was a troubling discovery. Over the past 15 years, the board had gradually expanded its enforcement powers with little oversight. At the next HOA meeting, I came prepared with highlighted bylaws and specific questions. When my turn came to speak, I asked about the approval process and inconsistent enforcement. Catherine smiled thinly and let me speak for precisely 1 minute before cutting me off. "Your 3 minutes of comment time has expired," she announced, though I had been speaking for barely 60 seconds. "But I have legitimate questions about the approval process," I persisted. Catherine leaned into her microphone. This is a perfect example of troublemaking from people who do not respect our community values. Next speaker, please. Several attendees shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one spoke up. As I gathered my papers, Catherine added loudly, "For those experiencing difficulties understanding our guidelines, perhaps homeownership in a covenant-controlled community is not the right fit." The humiliation burned through me as I walked back to my seat. A few neighbors avoided eye contact, while others gave sympathetic glances. The meeting continued as if nothing had happened. The final notice arrived 3 days later by certified mail. Final warning: removal of unauthorized ornamental fixture within 72 hours or legal action will commence for covenant enforcement, including police-supervised property removal and additional fines of $500 per day. I held the paper, my hands shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. The statue was all I had left of my mother, a physical connection to her memory. And now this woman I barely knew was threatening to take it from me by force. They came at 9 in the morning. A county sheriff's vehicle pulled up first, followed by Catherine's immaculate white Mercedes. I watched from my living room window as two officers approached my door with obvious reluctance. Catherine stood behind them, clipboard in hand, wearing a cream-colored pantsuit despite the casual Saturday morning. I opened the door before they knocked. The younger officer spoke first. "Good morning. I am Officer Rivera. This is Officer Tanner. We are here regarding a court order for property removal." His voice was professional, but his eyes conveyed discomfort. Catherine stepped forward. "As per the court order I obtained yesterday, we are here to remove the unauthorized fixture in violation of community covenants." She held up a document bearing an official seal. I stepped onto my porch, acutely aware of curtains moving in neighboring houses. Officer Tanner explained apologetically, "The court has authorized enforcement of the HOA covenant. We are here only to ensure there is no conflict during removal." Catherine smiled thinly. "I told you nobody gets special treatment in Maple Grove Estates," she said loud enough for anyone watching to hear. "Rules are rules." My face burned with humiliation as Catherine directed a maintenance worker toward my mother's statue. Neighbors watched from windows and porches as the man wrapped the stone angel in protective blankets and loaded it onto a small truck. The statue would be held in community storage until I paid all accumulated fines, now totaling over $2,000, plus removal and storage fees. "You will receive an invoice by Monday," Catherine said as they prepared to leave. "Further violations will result in property liens." After they departed, I sat on my front steps feeling utterly defeated. Mrs. Henderson from across the street hurried over with a thermos of tea. "It is not right, what she does," she whispered, her eyes darting toward Catherine's house down the street. "But no one can stand against her. The last board member who tried found himself facing bogus ethics violations and resigned." That night, sleep eluded me. The empty space in my garden seemed to mock my powerlessness. My home no longer felt like a sanctuary but a prison of arbitrary rules and constant surveillance. At work the following week, I could not concentrate. My students noticed my distraction, and my principal expressed concern about my haggard appearance. The joy had been stripped from homeownership. Each day brought dread of what new violation notice might await. My neighbors remained friendly but distant, afraid of association with Catherine's latest target. I began to consider selling the house, taking a financial loss just to escape this toxic environment. In desperation, I contacted 3 different attorneys. All said the same thing: fighting the HOA would be expensive with uncertain outcome. HOA covenants were legally binding contracts, and courts generally deferred to their authority. One lawyer estimated $15,000 to $20,000 in legal fees with no guarantee of success. Late one night, unable to sleep, I began researching HOA laws more broadly. State regulations, legal precedents, anything that might help. At nearly 3 in the morning, I stumbled across our county's property records website. On a whim, I searched for information about Maple Grove Estates. What I found sent an electric jolt through my exhaustion. Financial records for the HOA revealed curious patterns: maintenance contracts awarded to companies with obscure ownership, special assessments for projects that never materialized, administrative expenses far exceeding comparable communities. Catherine's name appeared in connections that seemed inappropriate for an HOA president. Further searching revealed that Catherine had served as president for 15 consecutive years, though the original bylaws limited officers to 3 consecutive one-year terms. Amendment records showed this provision had been changed during a special meeting with minimal attendance 10 years ago. The more I dug, the more irregularities appeared. Quarterly financial reports showed discrepancies. Enforcement records revealed patterns targeting specific homeowners while ignoring identical violations by others. Property line adjustments benefited certain board members at the expense of ordinary residents. Dawn broke as I sat surrounded by printouts and notes. This was no longer about my mother's statue. This was about justice for an entire community held hostage by bureaucratic tyranny. Legal action would be expensive and uncertain. Catherine had connections with local officials and seemingly unlimited resources for legal battles. But as I watched the sunrise paint my living room wall, I realized there were weapons more powerful than lawyers: information, community, and the courage to use both. With trembling hands but resolute heart, I made a pot of coffee and began formulating a plan that Catherine Winters never saw coming. The county library became my second home. Each evening after work, I claimed the same back corner table and methodically researched HOA law, governance requirements, and financial transparency regulations. The librarian, Ms. Chen, began saving relevant legal journals for me, curious about my sudden interest but respectful of my privacy. Homeowners associations operate under state laws with specific requirements, she explained one evening, placing a guidebook on HOA governance beside my laptop. There are rules for those who make the rules. I discovered our state required HOAs to maintain transparent financial records, hold open meetings with proper notice, follow specific voting procedures, and enforce covenants uniformly. The more I studied, the more convinced I became that Catherine's administration violated numerous provisions, likely deliberately. But documents alone would not be enough. I needed allies and evidence. I began with casual conversations, asking neighbors about their HOA experiences while walking my dog or collecting mail. Most were hesitant at first, conditioned by years of Catherine's retribution against dissenters. But in these brief interactions, I identified potential allies, those who rolled their eyes at mention of violation notices, or whose lawns showed subtle signs of resistance through non-conforming plants partially hidden behind conforming ones. Mr. Garcia, a retired accountant 3 houses down, invited me in for coffee after I mentioned my interest in HOA finances. His dining room table was covered with meticulous records of every HOA fee he had paid over 12 years. "Notice anything unusual?" he asked, pointing to the special assessment column. The pattern was striking. Special assessments had doubled under Catherine's leadership, Yet community amenities remained largely unchanged. The tennis courts still had the same cracks, the playground the same outdated equipment. Where did the money go? I wondered aloud. Precisely the question I asked at the budget meeting 4 years ago, Mr. Garcia replied. The next day, I received violation notices for my gutters, mailbox, and fence, all of which had passed inspection the previous month. Similar conversations followed. The Wilsons shared photos of their friend's gazebo, identical to one Catherine's friend had built, yet only theirs received violation notices. Mrs. Henderson had saved every community newsletter for a decade, revealing announcements of projects never completed. My breakthrough came from an unexpected source. After a particularly heated exchange at an HOA meeting, where Catherine once again cut off my questions about financial discrepancies, a woman approached me in the parking lot. "My name is Margaret," she whispered, glancing around nervously. "I work as the HOA treasurer's assistant. There are things you should know." We met at a cafe 2 towns over. Margaret had worked alongside the board for 8 years, witnessing Catherine's gradual consolidation of power. More importantly, she had documentation, copies of altered financial records showing discrepancies between reported expenses and actual expenditures. "She changes the numbers," Margaret explained, hands trembling as she passed me a manila envelope. "Landscaping contracts go to her brother-in-law's company at inflated rates. Community funds paid for emergency repairs to her personal property. The board members who sign off receive perks, violation forgiveness, property improvements, reduced fees." The most damning evidence came from a former board member who had kept records, just in case. Harold Simmons had served as secretary before questioning financial decisions and finding himself subjected to increasingly hostile treatment. "Catherine does not merely break rules," he explained during our meeting at his home. "She rewrites them to serve her purposes. Notice how the amendment process simplified over time, from requiring 2/3 homeowner approval to merely sufficient notice and board majority." By the end of 6 weeks, my dining room table resembled an investigation board. Financial discrepancies highlighted in yellow, procedural violations in blue, selective enforcement cases in green. The pattern was undeniable. Catherine had weaponized HOA authority for personal gain and power. But the question remained: how does one person stand against such a deeply entrenched system? I stared at the evidence spread before me, overwhelming in its totality yet individually insufficient. Catherine had connections with local officials, a reputation for crushing opposition, and the advantages of incumbency. A direct confrontation would fail. Legal action might eventually succeed, but at ruinous personal cost. What I needed was not a frontal assault, but a strategy that would use Catherine's own tactics against her. Not a lawyer, but something more powerful: the community itself. My kitchen table became command central for what I now thought of as Operation Community Restoration. The intelligence-gathering phase had yielded ammunition. Now, I needed a delivery system that would ensure maximum impact while protecting vulnerable allies. The first step was creating a secure communication channel. Using my limited tech skills, I established an anonymous online forum accessible only to verified Maple Grove residents. The welcome message was simple: a space to share experiences and information about our community governance, confidential and consequence-free. I seeded the forum with carefully redacted documentation of inconsistent enforcement, identical violations with drastically different outcomes depending on the homeowner's relationship with Catherine. Within days, dozens of residents joined, sharing their own experiences and evidence. The collective picture was more damning than I had imagined. For legal guidance, I turned to Professor James Collins at the State University's law school. Unable to afford conventional legal counsel, I attended his community legal clinic, bringing homemade lasagna in exchange for his expertise. "What you describe goes beyond simple mismanagement," he explained, reviewing my evidence. "The HOA has failed to maintain proper meeting notices and documentation. Their proxy voting practices violate state law. Financial reporting deficiencies alone could trigger regulatory intervention." Most critically, he identified a rarely invoked provision in the original HOA charter, predating Catherine's amendments, allowing members to force a special election with signatures from 40% of homeowners. The provision remains valid because it was filed with county records at inception, he explained. Internal bylaw changes cannot supersede charter requirements without similar filing, which they neglected to do. Weekend gatherings disguised as neighborhood potlucks became planning sessions. In Mrs. Henderson's sunroom, we developed a multi-pronged strategy: document collection, signature gathering, and preparation for a comprehensive presentation. Mr. Garcia led a team analyzing financial discrepancies. Harold Simmons coordinated documentation of procedural violations. Margaret, still employed by the treasurer, provided crucial insider information about ongoing activities, including Catherine's growing awareness of resident unrest. "She thinks it is just typical summer socializing," Margaret reported, "but she has scheduled more frequent violation inspections, possibly hopping to intimidate potential dissenters." My role involved creating presentation materials for the eventual confrontation. On weekends, I meticulously prepared comparison boards showing identical violations with different outcomes, charts tracking financial discrepancies, and timelines of procedural violations. The signature gathering required utmost discretion. Catherine monitored official petitions closely. Instead, we used everyday neighborhood interactions, dog walking meetups, mailbox conversations, playground gatherings, to explain our concerns and collect signatures on innocuous-looking community directory update forms. The actual petition for special meeting would be completed only when sufficient support was confirmed. By the 6th week, we had preliminary commitments from 38% of homeowners, just short of our required threshold. The remaining homes were either Catherine loyalists or residents too frightened of retaliation to engage. A breakthrough came when Terry Johnson, a local reporter who initially dismissed our concerns as neighborhood squabbles, began to see the broader implications. "This is not just about garden statues or paint colors," I explained during our 3rd meeting. "This is about abuse of power, potential financial misconduct, and a community held hostage through systematic intimidation." The evidence of financial irregularities particularly caught his attention. While he could not publish without more substantiation, he agreed to attend our planned special meeting as an interested community observer, his presence alone adding legitimacy and protection. As summer waned, Catherine grew increasingly suspicious of neighborhood activities. Violation notices increased in frequency and severity. When she arranged an unscheduled community walkthrough with board members, we used the opportunity to secure the final signatures needed from residents outraged by her intrusive inspections. With 43% of homeowners now committed, we prepared for the final phase. Under Harold's guidance, we meticulously followed every procedural requirement for calling a special meeting: proper notice period, formal submission of signatures, specific agenda items. The official request cited review of financial and procedural governance, rather than directly challenging Catherine's leadership, a strategic ambiguity that prevented her from identifying our true objective. The night before submission, I worked until dawn preparing individual information packets for each homeowner. Each contained documentation of violations relevant to their specific concerns, financial evidence, and a clear roadmap for HOA reform. Margaret confirmed the date when Catherine would be away at a regional HOA leadership conference, ensuring our petition would be processed by the vice president, a largely ceremonial position held by someone less vigilant in protecting Catherine's interests. The plan was not merely to win a battle over property rights, but to transform the very system that enabled abuse of power. The date was set, notices properly filed according to bylaws Catherine herself had neglected. As I sealed the last envelope, a strange calm settled over me. The trap was set, and the bait was Catherine's own arrogance. The guardian angel statue that started this journey remained in HOA storage, but its spirit had catalyzed something far more powerful, a community reclaiming its voice. The community center had never seen such attendance. Typically, HOA meetings drew at most 20 residents. Tonight, over 100 homeowners filled every available chair, lined the walls, and spilled into the hallway. The energy was palpable, a mixture of nervous anticipation and long-suppressed indignation. Catherine arrived 15 minutes before the scheduled start, her confident stride faltering momentarily at the sight of the crowd. She recovered quickly, arranging her materials at the board table with practiced precision. I watched her assess the room, likely assuming this unusual attendance was curiosity about the special meeting called by troublemakers. "This will be a straightforward review of procedures," she announced as she called the meeting to order, though I must note my disappointment at the unnecessary disruption to our normal schedule. The other board members nodded in synchronized agreement, except the treasurer, who studied his papers with unusual intensity. Margaret had informed me he had begun asking questions after noticing discrepancies she had strategically highlighted in recent reports. Following proper procedure, I approached the podium when public comments began, my laptop connected to the projector as Catherine watched with thinly veiled annoyance. Volunteers distributed information packets to each attendee. "Before we begin," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, "I want to clarify that this is not about garden statues or property disputes. This is about accountability." Catherine moved to interrupt, but I continued. "As per Bylaw Procedure 5.3, I have been granted 15 minutes for presentation as the petition organizer." Harold had coached me well. Catherine could not object without violating the very rules she claimed to uphold. The first slide showed comparative photos, identical violations with vastly different enforcement outcomes. Mrs. Wilson's non-approved trellis that received immediate fines contrasted with board member Thompson's identical structure that had stood for years without comment. The Garcia's unapproved mailbox design that generated weekly fines compared with nearly identical ones on Catherine Street that received approval. This pattern of selective enforcement violates state HOA regulations requiring uniform application of covenants, I explained, citing specific statutes Professor Collins had identified. Catherine interrupted. "These are isolated incidents taken out of context." "Please respect the speaker's time," Mr. Garcia called from the audience, citing the same meeting rules Catherine routinely used to silence others. The procedural violations came next, meeting minutes showing decisions made without required quorum, bylaw amendments passed without proper notice, architectural review decisions made by Catherine alone rather than the designated committee. Catherine's composure began to crack. "These allegations are baseless and potentially libelous," she said, her voice rising. "As president, I am adjourning this meeting until proper review." Point of order. Harold stood from his seat. Bylaw 7.2 states special meetings cannot be adjourned without majority vote of attending members. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as residents realized Catherine could not unilaterally end the meeting. Her face flushed as she retook her seat. Then came the financial records, original documents side by side with altered versions. The spreadsheet detailed questionable payments to companies traced back to Catherine's brother-in-law, landscaping contracts awarded without competitive bids, administrative expenses that exceeded comparable HOAs by 340%. These discrepancies represent over $237,000 of community funds over the past 5 years, I explained. Money collected from each homeowner that cannot be accounted for through legitimate community improvements. The room fell silent. Even Catherine's staunchest supporters appeared troubled. Mr. Evans, whose pool renovation questions had resulted in weekly violations, stood up. 3 years ago, I asked to see detailed expenses for the pool renovation. The next day, I received violation notices for my fence, driveway, and mailbox. All had passed inspection the previous month. His testimony opened the floodgates. One by one, residents shared experiences of retribution following questions about finances or procedures. Another revealed how their violations mysteriously disappeared after hearing Catherine's recommended contractor at inflated rates. The decisive moment came when Margaret rose from her seat, visibly trembling but resolute. "As assistant to the treasurer, I can confirm these financial discrepancies," she said. "I have witnessed systematic alteration of records, diversion of funds, and intimidation of anyone who questioned these practices." Catherine's face contorted with rage. "This is a conspiracy. You are all participating in libelous accusations. There will be consequences, lawsuits against everyone participating in this illegal meeting." Her verbal attack against Margaret, calling her incompetent, vindictive, and mentally unstable, shocked even her supporters. Phones recorded her tirade from dozens of angles as she gathered her papers and moved toward the exit, still shouting threats. The room temperature seemed to rise with collective anger as 15 years of intimidation crystallized into this moment of reckoning. Catherine slammed the door behind her, unaware that her departure marked not the end of the confrontation, but the beginning of community reclamation. The following morning dawned with a strange quiet over Maple Grove Estates. Neighbors stood in driveways and front yards, talking in hushed tones about the previous night's revelations. By noon, an emergency board meeting had been called by the vice president, who looked shell-shocked by his sudden prominence. In accordance with HOA charter provisions, the board voted unanimously to suspend Catherine from her position pending investigation. The treasurer, now facing scrutiny himself, resigned effective immediately. Within 48 hours, an interim board was established from respected community members with relevant professional backgrounds, an accountant, a retired judge, and a property manager. "Our first priority is a complete forensic audit," announced Mrs. Rodriguez, the interim president, during an outdoor community gathering. "Our second is establishing transparent governance procedures to prevent future abuses." Catherine responded with legal threats, filing injunctions against the board action and defamation claims against key speakers. Her attorney's cease and desist letters arrived at a dozen homes, including mine. but the community stood firm. A local law firm offered pro bono representation, recognizing the public interest aspects of the case. The forensic audit confirmed our worst suspicions and revealed new concerns. Nearly $300,000 had been diverted through inflated contracts, unnecessary expenses, and outright misappropriation over 8 years. The state HOA Oversight Board launched an investigation based on our evidence, freezing Catherine's assets related to HOA functions. County investigators reviewed financial records, while local prosecutors considered potential criminal charges for financial improprieties. Catherine's legal offensive collapsed when her own attorney withdrew representation after reviewing the evidence. Emergency board elections ushered in diverse leadership committed to transparency and fairness. I was nominated for a board position but declined, instead accepting an advisory role on bylaw revision. My expertise, hard-won through months of research, proved valuable in restructuring governance procedures. The recovered funds were allocated to long-neglected community improvements. Playground equipment that had been pending replacement for years was finally installed. The community garden space Catherine had opposed was established on previously unused common ground. The tennis courts received their long-promised resurfacing. The new board's first official act was a unanimous vote to create clear, objective property standards with enforcement procedures requiring multiple reviews. Weekly, transparency emails detailed all HOA actions and financial decisions. Meeting minutes were posted within 24 hours, and all financial records became available for resident review. Most meaningful to me personally was the day the garden angel returned to my yard. The new board had immediately reversed all of Catherine's selective enforcement actions, including the removal of my mother's statue. But what began as a simple reinstallation became something more significant. Neighbors gathered on my front lawn as Mr. Johnson and Mr. Garcia carefully placed the stone angel on its pedestal. Mrs. Henderson brought fresh flowers to surround it. Children from the block presented hand-painted welcome signs for the angel's return. "This is not just about a statue," Mrs. Rodriguez said, addressing the gathered residents. "This is about restoring the proper relationship between rules and community. Rules should protect, not punish. They should unite, not divide." The transformation extended beyond governance. Neighbors who had barely spoken now collaborated on community improvement projects. The elderly gentleman whose roses were removed years ago received community help planting new bushes. The single mother who lost her boundary dispute saw proper survey and restoration. 6 months after the confrontation, Catherine sold her house and moved away. The legal consequences of her actions continued to unfold through civil proceedings and regulatory penalties. But for the community, her departure was less significant than the positive changes her absence enabled. I stood in my front yard one evening, watching children play freely between houses without fear of violation notices. A young family had moved into Catherine's former home, already integrated into neighborhood activities, with an enthusiasm that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. This journey had never been about winning against Catherine or even about my mother's garden statue. It was about transforming a collection of houses into a true community where rules exist to support rather than suppress, where power serves rather than dominates, where transparency defeats tyranny. As sunset bathed the neighborhood in golden light, I realized my most powerful weapon had never been evidence or legal knowledge, but the courage to build community against isolation. The garden angel stood serenely amidst new flowers, watching over a neighborhood that had found its heart again.